How to Stop Vaping with Critical Thinking, a project manager's blueprint for breaking free from addiction and building a better life. Prologue: A Father's Journey. The kitchen clock read 11:47 p.m. as Michael Thompson sat at his dining room table, staring at the vape pen in his hand. His 15-year-old son Jake's words from dinner still echoed in his mind. "Dad, I'm worried about you." The concern in his son's eyes had struck deeper than any anti-vaping advertisement or health warning ever could. At 43, Michael had been fighting his nicotine addiction for over half his life. He still remembered his first cigarette at 20, standing outside his college dorm on a cold winter night. What started as a social habit quickly became a daily routine, then a necessity. The past 2 decades had been marked by countless attempts to quit, each failure leaving him feeling more powerless than before. 3 years ago, following his divorce and gaining full custody of Jake, Michael switched to vaping. Like many others, he convinced himself it was a healthier alternative. "At least it's not cigarettes," he would tell himself as he took another hit from his vape pen, the sweet vapor filling his lungs with artificial comfort. But deep down, he knew he had merely traded one addiction for another. Tonight felt different, though. As a project manager for a construction company, Michael prided himself on his ability to solve complex problems through careful analysis and systematic thinking. Yet here he was unable to break free from a habit that was affecting not only his health, but also his relationship with his son. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could manage million-dollar projects, but couldn't manage his own addiction. "Maybe I've been approaching this all wrong," he murmured to himself, pulling out his worn leather notebook. Over the years, his quit attempts had followed a familiar pattern. Emotional decisions made in moments of guilt or fear, followed by white-knuckled willpower that inevitably crumbled under stress. Each failure reinforced his belief that he wasn't strong enough to quit. But what if strength wasn't the issue? What if, like the complex projects he managed at work, quitting vaping required more than just determination? What if it needed the same critical thinking skills he applied in his professional life? Michael thought back to his most recent project, rehabilitating an old warehouse into modern offices. The challenge hadn't been about brute force or simple solutions. It required understanding the building's structural issues, analyzing various approaches, and developing a comprehensive plan that addressed every aspect of the renovation. Could the same principles apply to breaking his addiction? Instead of seeing vaping as a simple bad habit to break through willpower alone, what if he approached it as a complex problem requiring careful analysis and strategic planning? As a single father, Michael was acutely aware of the example he set for Jake. His son was entering a critical age, one where the pressures and temptations of nicotine use were all too real. Every time Michael vaped, he felt the weight of hypocrisy. How could he tell his son to make healthy choices when he couldn't do the same? The realization hit him. His vaping wasn't just about nicotine addiction anymore. It had become a barrier between him and the father he wanted to be. His previous attempts to quit had focused solely on the physical addiction, ignoring the complex web of emotional and psychological factors that kept him reaching for his vape pen. Drawing from his project management experience, Michael knew that successful outcomes required more than just identifying the problem. They needed a deep understanding of all contributing factors. He began writing in his notebook, this time approaching his addiction with the same analytical mindset he brought to his work projects. He wrote about his triggers, the stress of single parenthood, the loneliness after his divorce, the habitual nature of vaping during his work breaks. He noted how vaping had become his automatic response to emotional discomfort, a crutch he relied on rather than developing healthier coping mechanisms. As midnight approached, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Not the desperate, wishful thinking of his previous quit attempts, but the quiet confidence that comes from approaching a problem with clarity and purpose. He realized that this book could be different from the countless quit-smoking guides he'd tried before. This wasn't about scare tactics or simple willpower. It was about applying critical thinking to understand and overcome addiction. This book is for people like Michael, those who have tried and failed to quit vaping, those who know they need to stop but feel trapped in a cycle they can't break. It's for parents who want to set a better example for their children, for professionals who excel in other areas of life but struggle with this particular challenge, and for anyone ready to approach quitting vaping with a new perspective. Through Michael's journey, which will follow throughout this book, We'll explore how critical thinking can transform the way we understand and overcome vaping addiction. We'll see how breaking free from vaping isn't just about fighting cravings. It's about analyzing our behaviors, understanding our triggers, and developing strategic solutions that address both the physical and psychological aspects of addiction. As Michael closed his notebook that night, he made a promise to himself and to Jake. This time would be different. Not because he was stronger or more determined, but because he was finally ready to think critically about his addiction and tackle it with the same analytical skills that had served him so well in other areas of his life. Are you ready to join Michael on this journey? Turn the page, and let's begin applying critical thinking to break free from vaping addiction. Remember, this isn't just another quit attempt. It's an opportunity to change how you approach challenges in your life fundamentally. Chapter 1. Understanding Your Enemy. A deep dive into your vaping habit. The morning after his late-night revelation, Michael sat in his office, a fresh page of his notebook open before him. Through the window, he could see construction workers arriving at the site of his latest project. Each day, before any work began, his team conducted a thorough site analysis. Yet in all his years of trying to quit nicotine, he had never applied the same methodical approach to understanding his addiction. "You can't solve a problem you don't fully understand," Michael muttered, remembering the words of his first project mentor. As he reached instinctively for his vape pen, he stopped himself. Instead of taking his usual morning hit, he decided to examine the urge itself. The craving felt like an old friend, familiar, insistent, almost comforting in its predictability. But today, instead of immediately satisfying it, Michael began to write. Time: 8:15 a.m. Physical sensations: slight headache, restlessness in hands, emotional state. Anxious, slightly irritable trigger. Morning routine: preparing for daily team meeting, intensity of urge, 7 out of 10. This simple act of observation created a tiny but crucial gap between stimulus and response. For the first time, Michael wasn't just experiencing the craving, he was studying it. As the day progressed, he continued his documentation, treating his addiction like a project that needed thorough analysis. By lunchtime, patterns began to emerge that he had never noticed before. His vaping wasn't just about nicotine. It was woven into the fabric of his daily life in ways he hadn't realized. During his lunch break, Michael called his friend David, a successful architect who had quit smoking 5 years ago. "I need you to be brutally honest with me," Michael said. "What do you see when you look at my vaping habit?" David's response was thoughtful. "You know what I notice? You vape most heavily when you're problem-solving. It's like your brain has linked nicotine with finding solutions. Every time you face a challenge, whether it's a work issue or something with Jake, out comes the vape pen." This observation hit home. Michael thought about the previous evening, how he had reached for his vape while helping Jake with his math homework. It wasn't the nicotine craving driving that moment. It was the ingrained association between vaping and thinking through problems. That afternoon, Michael had a breakthrough during a project meeting. As he presented the latest construction timeline to his team, he noticed how his hand automatically reached for his pocket when faced with challenging questions. The vape pen had become his security blanket, a crutch he leaned on whenever he needed to think clearly or handle stress. Back in his office, Michael began mapping out his vaping patterns the same way he would analyze a project's workflow. He identified several key triggers: morning coffee and project planning, team meetings and presentations, problem-solving sessions, after-dinner conversations, with Jake, late-night work emails. But more importantly, he started to understand the emotional landscape of his addiction. Vaping wasn't just a physical dependency. It had become his go-to strategy for emotional regulation. When he felt stressed about being a single parent, he vaped. When he worried about Jake's future, he vaped. When he felt lonely in the quiet hours after Jake went to bed, he vaped. That evening, as he sat with Jake at dinner, Michael shared his insights. "I've been thinking a lot about why I vape," he began, "and I realize it's not just about the nicotine. It's become my way of dealing with everything: stress, anxiety, even happiness." Jake looked up from his plate, surprised by his father's openness. "Is that why you vape more when we're doing my homework together?" Michael nodded, touched by his son's perceptiveness. "Exactly. I've trained my brain to think I needed to concentrate to solve problems. But today I started looking at it differently. Like one of my construction projects. You can't fix something until you understand exactly what's wrong. Later that night, Michael reflected on a crucial realization. His previous attempts to quit had failed because he had treated vaping as a simple habit to break through willpower alone. In reality, it was a complex system of behavioral, emotional, and physical dependencies, each requiring its own strategy to overcome. He opened his laptop and created a document titled Project Freedom, approaching his quit plan with the same thoroughness he would apply to a major construction project. Foundation analysis. Understanding the full scope of the addiction. Physical dependency on nicotine. Behavioral patterns and triggers. Emotional coping mechanisms. Social and environmental factors. Structural assessment. Identifying weak points and strengths. Time/situations when cravings are strongest. Current coping strategies and their effectiveness. Available support systems. Potential obstacles to success. Building plans. Developing targeted strategies. Physical withdrawal management. Alternative stress management techniques. Environmental modifications. Support system engagement. As Michael reviewed his notes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in his previous quit attempts. A sense of clarity and purpose. This wasn't about fighting against his addiction through sheer willpower. It was about understanding it, dismantling it piece by piece, and building something better in its place. The next morning, when Michael arrived at work, he did something different. Instead of starting his day with a vape, he took a moment to check in with himself, noting his physical sensations and emotional state. The craving was there, strong as ever, but now he saw it for what it was. Not an insurmountable force, but a complex challenge waiting to be solved. He thought about Jake, about the example he wanted to set. His son had already shown such maturity in supporting this journey. Now it was time for Michael to match that maturity with a thoughtful, strategic approach to overcoming his addiction. Understanding your vaping habit isn't just about acknowledging that it's unhealthy or counting how many times you vape per day. It's about developing a deep, analytical understanding of how this addiction operates in your life. This first step, this careful, critical analysis, lays the foundation for everything that follows. As we continue Michael's journey in the next chapter, we'll explore how to use this understanding to develop specific strategies for breaking free from vaping. But for now, take some time to conduct your own analysis. Look at your habit with the same analytical eye you bring to other challenges in your life. Remember, you can't outthink an enemy you don't understand. Ask yourself, when do you vape most frequently? What emotions trigger your urge to vape? How has vaping become integrated into your daily routines? What role does vaping play in your social interactions? What are you really seeking when you reach for your vape pen? The answers to these questions will form the foundation of your journey to freedom from vaping. Like Michael, you may find that the simple act of understanding your addiction changes how you view it and yourself. Chapter 2. Building your strategy. More than just willpower. The construction site was quiet when Michael arrived before dawn, a week after beginning his analysis. The skeletal framework of the renovated warehouse loomed against the purple sky, reminding him of his own work in progress. As he walked the perimeter with his morning coffee, a ritual that usually included his vape pen, he thought about how similar this project was to his quest to quit vaping. Every successful project starts with a solid strategy, he reminded himself, feeling the familiar morning craving gnaw at his concentration. The past week of documenting his vaping habits had revealed patterns he'd never noticed before, but knowledge alone wasn't enough. He needed to transform these insights into action. The previous evening had brought this need into sharp focus. Jake had asked him a simple but profound question over dinner. "Dad, what's different about this time? How do you know you won't fail again?" The question had kept Michael awake most of the night. He realized that while his analytical approach had given him new insights, he still hadn't developed a concrete plan for actually quitting. As he watched the sun rise over the construction site, he began to formulate his strategy, drawing parallels between project management and addiction recovery. Just as he wouldn't demolish a building without first ensuring the structural integrity of surrounding structures, he couldn't simply stop vaping without having support systems in place. His previous attempts had failed partly because he'd tried to rely solely on willpower, like trying to hold up a collapsing wall with his bare hands. Michael pulled out his notebook and began writing about a conversation he'd had with his doctor yesterday. Dr. Roberts had explained how nicotine addiction works on both physical and psychological levels, comparing it to a two-front battle. Think of it like renovating a building while people are still working inside. She had said, you need to maintain the essential functions while making fundamental changes. This metaphor resonated deeply with Michael. He thought about how, in construction, they often created temporary supports while rebuilding foundational elements. Perhaps he needed the same approach with quitting vaping, temporary supports while he rebuilt his coping mechanisms. Walking back to his office, Michael remembered a particularly challenging project from last year. They needed to preserve a historic facade while completely rebuilding the interior. The solution had involved a complex sequence of smaller projects, each building upon the last. Maybe that was the key he'd been missing in his previous quit attempts. At his desk, Michael began drafting what he called his reconstruction plan. Instead of setting a single quit date, he mapped out a gradual transition. He would start by identifying specific times and situations where he could begin reducing his vaping, while simultaneously building new habits to support these changes. His first target was his morning routine. Every day, he'd arrive at the site early, vape pen in one hand, coffee in the other, as he reviewed project updates. Starting tomorrow, he decided he would replace the vaping with a short walk around the site, using the time to practice the breathing exercises Dr. Roberts had recommended. Michael also thought carefully about his role as a single father. Jake had baseball practice 3 evenings a week, and Michael had gotten into the habit of vaping in the car while waiting. He realized these moments of forced inactivity were perfect opportunities to develop new coping mechanisms. He could use that time for reading, catching up with friends on the phone, or even learning a new language through audio lessons. That afternoon, Michael called his sister Sarah, who had successfully quit smoking years ago. The hardest part, she told him, wasn't the physical cravings. It was learning to live differently. You have to become a different person. Her words struck a chord. Michael had been approaching quitting as something to endure until he could get back to normal. But maybe the goal wasn't to return to normal. It was to create a new normal altogether. This insight led him to consider the broader changes he needed to make. At work, he had noticed how heavily he relied on vaping during stressful meetings. Rather than trying to white-knuckle through these situations, he needed to develop new stress management techniques beforehand. He scheduled a meeting with his team for the next morning. Being open about his quit attempt wasn't easy, but he knew from experience that transparent communication was crucial for any major project success. To his surprise, several team members shared their own stories of battling addiction, offering support and practical suggestions. That evening, Michael sat down with Jake to share his strategy. Remember how we renovated your bedroom last summer? He asked. We didn't just tear everything down at once. We had a plan, did it step by step, and made sure we had somewhere for you to sleep each night. Jake nodded, understanding the analogy. So, what's your first step? Michael explained his plan for gradually replacing vaping with other activities, starting with his morning routine. Jake immediately offered to join him for early morning walks whenever he could, turning what could have been a lonely challenge into an opportunity for father-son bonding. As they discussed the plan, Michael realized something crucial. His previous attempts had failed partly because he'd tried to handle everything alone. This time, he was building a support network, just as he would never attempt a major construction project without a reliable team. That night, as Michael reviewed his strategy, he felt different about this quit attempt. Instead of the usual anxiety and dread, he felt a sense of purpose and direction. He wasn't just trying to stop a bad habit. He was building something new. He thought about the warehouse project, how each day brought small but visible progress. Tomorrow would be his first morning without vaping at the site. It was a small step, but like laying the first brick in a new wall. It was a crucial beginning. As he prepared for bed, Michael added one final note to his journal. Success isn't about having enough willpower to resist cravings. It's about building a life where those cravings have less power over you. This understanding would prove crucial in the days ahead, as he began implementing his strategy one careful step at a time. The challenge wasn't just to stop vaping. It was to become someone who no longer needed to vape. The next chapter of his journey would test this strategy, as theory met reality in the harsh light of daily challenges. But for now, Michael had something he'd never had in previous quit attempts: a clear path forward, built on understanding rather than just determination. As he turned out the light, he thought about Jake's question from dinner. What was different this time? Everything. Because this time, he wasn't just trying to quit vaping. He was reconstructing his life, one deliberate choice at a time. Chapter 3. When Theory Meets Reality. The first week. The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m. Michael's hand instinctively reached for his vape pen on the nightstand, but found only his journal instead. Day one of his new strategy had officially begun, and already his body was protesting the change. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of poor sleep. He tossed and turned most of the night, his mind racing with doubts about the journey ahead. The morning craving hit him like a wave, more intense than he'd expected. This was the moment theory would meet reality. One step at a time, he whispered, remembering his project management mantra. Instead of his usual morning vape, he forced himself through the new routine he'd planned. A glass of water, 5 minutes of deep breathing exercises, and a shower. Each minute felt like an hour. But he knew from experience that the hardest part of any project was often the beginning. Jake was already awake when Michael came downstairs, surprisingly dressed for their planned morning walk. "You didn't have to get up this early," Michael said, touched by his son's support. "I know," Jake replied with a slight smile. "But you always say the hardest projects need the best team." Their walk around the neighborhood was quiet at first, both adjusting to the early hour. The familiar urge to vape gnawed at Michael's concentration, but having Jake beside him provided an anchor. They talked about school, baseball, and Jake's upcoming science project. Normal conversations that helped distract from the abnormal feelings coursing through Michael's body. At work, the real challenges began. His first team meeting without his vape pen was particularly difficult. His hands felt restless, and he caught himself reaching for his pocket several times. But he had prepared for this. Following his strategy, he kept a stress ball on the table and focused on his breathing whenever the urge became strong. His project supervisor, Tom, noticed the change. "You seem tense today," he commented after the meeting. Michael decided to be honest. "I'm quitting vaping. Today's day one." Tom's face lit up with understanding. "Ah, that explains it. I quit smoking 10 years ago. Hardest and best thing I ever did. What's your strategy?" The conversation that followed revealed that Tom had valuable insights to share. He suggested breaking down meetings into shorter segments with brief breaks, a simple adjustment that could make them more manageable while dealing with withdrawal symptoms. By lunchtime, Michael was fighting a pounding headache, another expected withdrawal symptom. He had planned for this too, keeping pain relievers in his desk. What he hadn't planned for was the emotional volatility. When a contractor called to report a delay in materials delivery, Michael found his frustration spiraling out of proportion. He stepped outside, pulling out his phone to read through the notes he'd made about dealing with stress. The contractor's call wasn't just about the delay. It was his first real test of handling work stress without nicotine. He took several deep breaths, remembering Dr. Roberts' advice about riding out the wave of emotion rather than trying to suppress it. The afternoon brought another unexpected challenge. Sarah, his sister, called with news about their mother's minor health scare. In the past, this would have been an automatic trigger for vaping. Instead, Michael found himself pacing his office, anxiety building with nowhere to go. He opened his journal and began writing a new coping mechanism he was trying to develop. "Mom's okay. The panic I'm feeling isn't just about her. It's amplified by withdrawal. This is temporary. I can handle this discomfort. It doesn't mean I need to vape." The act of writing helped clear his mind enough to have a rational conversation with Sarah about their mother's situation. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The evening proved to be the biggest hurdle. After Jake went to bed, the house felt eerily quiet. This was usually Michael's time to unwind with his vape pen, reviewing emails and planning the next day. The emptiness of his hands was maddening. He called David, his friend from the architecture firm, who had offered to be on his support team. "The evenings are the worst," Michael admitted. "Everything feels wrong." "Of course it does," David replied. "You're breaking up with a long-term relationship. It's supposed to feel wrong at first. Remember when you first started as a project manager? How overwhelming everything felt. But you learned, adapted, grew into it. This is the same thing. The comparison helped shift Michael's perspective. He wasn't just ending something, he was learning something new. Like mastering a new skill at work, it would take time and practice to feel natural. Before bed, Michael reviewed his journal entries from the day. The physical symptoms had been rough: headache, irritability, difficulty concentrating. But he had managed to stick to his strategy, using the tools and support systems he'd put in place. It wasn't pretty, but he had made it through day one. He added a final note: progress isn't about perfection. It's about adaptation and persistence. Today was hard, but it was supposed to be hard. That's how I know I'm actually changing something. The next few days followed a similar pattern, each bringing its own unique challenges. On day 3, a major issue arose at the construction site. In the past, Michael would have chain vaped through the crisis. Instead, he found himself applying project management principles to his cravings. Identify the problem, break it down into manageable parts, address each component systematically. By day 5, the physical symptoms began to ease slightly, but the psychological challenges intensified. A simple coffee with friends became complicated when one of them offered him a hit from their vape pen. Michael had prepared for this too, having rehearsed his response. "No thanks, I'm rebuilding right now." The construction metaphor helped him frame his quit attempt in terms he and his friends could understand. The weekend brought its own set of trials. Without work to distract him, Michael found himself facing longer stretches of time where his mind could wander toward cravings. He and Jake had planned ahead, filling Saturday with activities: a morning hike, Jake's baseball game, and a home improvement project they'd been putting off. During a quiet moment working on their project, Jake asked, "Is it getting any easier?" Michael considered the question carefully. "Not exactly easier," he replied, "but more familiar. Like when you first started playing baseball. The movements felt awkward at first, but with practice, they started to make sense." As the first week drew to a close, Michael sat at his dining room table, reflecting on the experience. His strategy hadn't worked perfectly. Some tools he'd planned to use proved impractical, while other unexpected techniques emerged through necessity. But the framework had held. By approaching his quit attempt systematically rather than relying solely on willpower, he had made it through 7 days, longer than any previous attempt. He knew the journey was far from over. Like any major project, there would be setbacks, unexpected challenges, and moments of doubt. But he had proved to himself that his analytical approach could work, that preparation and strategy could stand up to the real-world pressures of quitting. As he got ready for bed, Michael found his old vape pen in a drawer. Instead of the usual craving, he felt something different, a mix of pride and determination. He wasn't just trying to quit anymore. He was actively building a new version of himself, one day at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he had validation that his approach was working. Theory had met reality, and while the collision had been messy at times, he had remained standing. The foundation was set. Now it was time to build upon it. Chapter 4. Beyond the first week, adapting to a new normal. 2 weeks had passed since Michael's last vape, and he sat in his favorite coffee shop early Sunday morning, reflecting on an unexpected discovery. The hardest moments weren't always about nicotine cravings. Sometimes they were about identity. Yesterday, at Jake's baseball game, he watched other parents step away between innings for their nicotine fixes. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in a social circle he'd been part of for years. The physical withdrawal symptoms had begun to subside, but this sense of displacement, of no longer knowing exactly where he fit, was something his carefully planned strategy hadn't fully prepared him for. "The thing about renovation," he wrote in his journal, "is that there's always a messy middle phase. The old structure is gone, but the new one isn't fully formed yet. That's where I am now." His phone buzzed with a text from Tom, his project supervisor. "Monthly team dinner tomorrow. You still coming?" Michael's thumb hovered over the reply button. These dinners usually involve drinks, vaping, and relaxed conversation. The thought of navigating that environment without his usual crutch made his stomach tighten. This is part of the reconstruction, he reminded himself, thinking back to his conversation with Dr. Roberts earlier that week. She had explained how the brain needs time to build new neural pathways, to learn new ways of being social, managing stress, and finding pleasure without nicotine. Michael typed his response, "I'll be there." Then he added, "But might leave early. Still working on my rebuild project." The previous week had taught him valuable lessons about adaptation. His original strategy, while solid, had needed regular adjustments. Some techniques worked better than expected. The morning walks with Jake had become a cherished routine, offering not just distraction from cravings but precious time with his son. Other approaches had proven less effective. The stress ball he bought for meetings mostly sat and used in his desk drawer. What had emerged instead were unexpected coping mechanisms. During a particularly stressful project review, he'd found himself sketching in the margins of his notebook, something he hadn't done since architecture school. The simple act of drawing helped focus his mind and calm his nerves more effectively than any of his planned strategies. His relationship with Jake was evolving too. Last night, they'd had a long conversation about resilience and change, sparked by Jake's struggles with a new pitching technique. Michael found himself sharing insights from his quit journey that applied surprisingly well to his son's baseball challenges. "It's not about being perfect," he told Jake. "It's about being willing to feel uncomfortable while you learn something new." The coffee shop began to fill with the Sunday morning crowd. Michael watched a young woman at the next table absent-mindedly reach for her vape pen, a gesture he knew intimately. He felt a familiar tug of craving, but noticed something different. It was less about the nicotine now, and more about the ritual, the comfort of familiar patterns. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email from a contractor about budget concerns for the warehouse project. In the past, this would have been a 2-vape minimum situation. Instead, Michael opened his journal to a fresh page and began breaking down the problem step by step, the same way he analyzed his cravings. The parallel between project management and addiction recovery had deepened over the past 2 weeks. Both required constant monitoring, regular strategy adjustments, and a willingness to learn from setbacks. Just last week, after a particularly challenging day at work, he found himself in a convenience store, hand-reaching for a disposable vape pen. He'd stopped himself, but the close call had taught him something important about overconfidence. That evening, he'd revised his strategy, adding new contingency plans for high-stress situations. Like any good project manager, he knew that setbacks weren't failures. They were data points, opportunities to strengthen the overall plan. The mother-daughter pair at the table across from him caught his attention. The daughter, probably around Jake's age, was animatedly describing a school project while her mother listened intently. Michael thought about his own increased presence and clarity in conversations with Jake since quitting. Without the constant distraction of vaping and cravings, he found himself more fully engaged in these moments. His watch showed 9:30 a.m. Time for Jake's Sunday morning baseball practice. As Michael gathered his things, he realized something profound. For the first time that morning, he had gone several hours without actively thinking about not vaping. The spaces between cravings were growing longer, slowly but noticeably. At the baseball field, Michael watched Jake warm up with his teammates. Another parent, Steve, joined him on the bleachers. Steve had been quit smoking for 5 years, and their shared experience of nicotine addiction had led to several meaningful conversations. "How's the rebuild going?" Steve asked, using Michael's preferred terminology. "It's different than I expected," Michael replied. "The physical part is getting easier, but I'm still figuring out who I am without it." Steve nodded knowingly. "That's the real project, isn't it? The nicotine leaves your system pretty quickly. Building a new version of yourself. That's the long game." As they watched the practice, Michael thought about the phases of construction. The demolition phase, the initial quit, had been dramatic and visible. Now he was in the slower, more detailed work of reconstruction. Each day, without vaping, was like adding another brick to the new structure he was building. Later that afternoon, Michael and Jake stopped by the warehouse project. Sunday visits had become part of their routine, a way for Michael to check progress and show Jake the practical applications of planning and persistence. "See how the new support beams connect to the old foundation?" Michael explained. "That's what I'm doing with this quit attempt, building new patterns that connect to the stable parts of my life." Jake studied the construction thoughtfully. Like how we still do our morning walks even though the cravings aren't as bad anymore. Exactly. Some changes we make to deal with a specific problem, but they end up becoming valuable on their own. That evening, as Michael prepared for the week ahead, he reviewed his journal entries from the past 2 weeks. The progression was clear, from minute-by-minute survival in those first days to a more sustainable rhythm of recovery. The cravings hadn't disappeared, but his relationship with them had changed. He added a new note: success isn't just about not vaping. It's about building a life where vaping becomes unnecessary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the team dinner. But Michael felt more confident in his ability to handle them, not because the challenges would be easier, but because he was getting stronger, more adaptable, more certain of his new identity as a non-vapor. As he closed his journal, he remembered something Tom had said about construction. The best buildings aren't just built to last, they're built to adapt. Maybe that was the key to long-term success in quitting vaping too, building a new life flexible enough to handle whatever challenges came next. The sound of Jake practicing his pitching in the backyard drifted through the window. Michael smiled, realizing that while he had started this journey to quit vaping, he was actually building something far more important, a better version of himself for his son to look up to. Chapter 5: Redefining Yourself. The Social Architecture of Change. 1 month into his journey, Michael found himself facing an unexpected challenge. His ex-wife had called, wanting to meet for coffee to discuss Jake's upcoming school year. These meetings were always tense, but this would be his first one without the chemical comfort of nicotine. Sitting in his car outside the cafe, Michael took several deep breaths, remembering Dr. Roberts' words about emotional preparation. In the past month, he'd learned that the hardest moments weren't always about physical cravings. They were about navigating emotional landscapes without his usual coping mechanisms. Inside, his ex-wife Catherine was already seated, 2 coffees on the table. "You look different," she said as he sat down. "Less fidgety." The observation caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost by quitting vaping that he hadn't fully noticed what he'd gained. His hands were steadier. He could maintain eye contact without the constant distraction of planning his next vape break. "I quit vaping," he said simply. "About a month ago." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "Jake mentioned it. He's really proud of you, you know." The conversation that followed was still challenging. Discussions about school expenses and summer plans never weren't. But Michael found himself more present, more capable of engaging with the actual issues rather than just managing his anxiety through vaping. Later that afternoon, at the construction site, Michael reflected on how his professional demeanor had evolved too. His project meetings had become more focused, his decisions clearer. Tom had commented just yesterday about his improved problem-solving skills. "It's like you're seeing the whole blueprint now," Tom had said, "not just the section you're working on." Michael understood what he meant. Without the constant interruption of vaping breaks and cravings, he could hold more complex problems in his mind, see connections he might have missed before. The mental fog he'd grown so accustomed to had lifted gradually, like morning mist burning off a job site. His phone buzzed. A text from David. "Monthly poker night still on for Friday? Guys asking about you." The poker nights had been a regular fixture in Michael's life for years, an evening of cards, conversation, and nearly continuous vaping. He'd skipped the last 2 gatherings, unsure if he was ready to face that particular challenge. But after today's successful meeting with Catherine, he felt stronger, more confident in his new identity. "Count me in," he replied, adding, "Still not vaping, though." David's response was immediate. "Proud of you, man. I'll keep the windows open." That evening, helping Jake with his history homework, Michael noticed another subtle change. In the past, he would have been half listening, part of his attention always reserved for monitoring his nicotine levels, planning his next vape break. Now he was fully engaged in Jake's discussion about World War II, actually enjoying the learning process alongside his son. "Dad," Jake said suddenly, looking up from his textbook, "remember when you used to take vape breaks during homework time? I always worried you weren't really interested in helping me." The comment stung, but it also validated Michael's efforts. "I'm sorry about that, buddy. I was interested. I just wasn't very good at showing it back then." "I know," Jake smiled. "You're better at it now." That night, unable to sleep, Michael pulled out his journal. The entries had evolved from desperate recordings of cravings and triggers to deeper reflections on identity and change. He wrote about his meeting with Catherine, about the poker night invitation, about Jake's homework observation. "It's not just about not vaping anymore," he wrote. "It's about becoming someone who doesn't need to vape. Every interaction is a chance to practice being this new version of myself." The next morning at work, Michael faced another test of his evolving identity. A major supplier had missed a crucial deadline, threatening the project's timeline. In the past, this would have sent him straight for his vape pen, seeking chemical calm in the midst of crisis. Instead, he gathered his team for an emergency meeting. With clear eyes and steady hands, he led them through a systematic problem-solving session. One of the younger project managers stayed behind afterward. "That was impressive," she said. "The way you handled everyone's panic without getting caught up in it yourself." Michael realized she was right. He had managed the crisis differently, not just without vaping, but with a new kind of confidence that came from facing challenges clear-headed. Friday night arrived, and with it the poker game. Walking into David's garage, now cloudy with vapor from other players' devices, Michael felt a moment of vertigo. The familiar environment triggered old patterns, muscle memories of reaching for his vape pen. But he had prepared for this. In his pocket was a smooth stone Jake had given him, something to occupy his hands. He'd eaten a proper dinner beforehand, knowing that hunger could magnify cravings. Most importantly, he developed a new understanding of himself in these social situations. "The usual buy-in?" someone asked as he sat down. "Yeah," Michael replied, "but I'm playing straight these days. Clear head, you know?" The choice of words was deliberate, framing his non-vaping status as a strength rather than a deprivation. To his surprise, the other players seemed to respect this. One even mentioned he'd been thinking about quitting himself. As the night progressed, Michael discovered he actually played better without the constant breaks and nicotine hits. He could focus on the other players' tells, track the flow of the game more clearly. When he left 3 hours later, up $40 and feeling clear-headed, he realized he'd enjoyed himself more than he had in years. Driving home, Michael thought about how his definition of strength had changed over the past month. What once seemed like an impossible deprivation had become a source of pride and capability. Each social situation he navigated without vaping built his confidence further. The warehouse project was nearing a crucial phase of completion, and Michael saw parallels with his own journey. The basic structure was solid now, but the fine details, the finishing work that would make it truly complete, still required careful attention. In his journal that night, he wrote, "Rebuilding isn't just about replacing what was torn down. It's about creating something better, stronger, more authentic. Every day, I choose not to vape is another day I choose to be fully present in my life." The next morning, at Jake's baseball game, Michael found himself sharing his experiences with another parent who was struggling to quit smoking. As he talked about his journey, he realized how far he'd come from that first desperate night when he'd stared at his vape pen, feeling powerless. The hardest part, he told the other parent, isn't the physical addiction. It's believing you could be a different person. But once you start seeing yourself differently, everything else follows. Looking out at Jake on the pitcher's mound, focused and determined, Michael felt a deep sense of contentment. He was building more than just a nicotine-free life. He was building a legacy of resilience and authentic living for his son. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of temptation, more situations that tested his new identity. But Michael now understood that these challenges weren't threats to his progress. They were opportunities to strengthen his new foundation, one conscious choice at a time. Chapter 6. Paying It Forward. The Unexpected Power of Helping Others. 3 months had passed since Michael's last vape when he received an unexpected email from Tom, his project supervisor. "Got a minute to talk? Not about work." The conversation that followed would open an entirely new chapter in Michael's recovery journey. Tom was waiting in the site office, looking unusually nervous. "My daughter started vaping," he said without preamble. "She's 16. I found her device yesterday, and I remembered how you handled quitting. Thought maybe you could offer some insight." Michael sat quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of this trust. Just a few months ago, he had been the one desperately seeking answers. Now he was being asked to guide someone else. The irony wasn't lost on him. The first thing I learned, Michael began carefully, was that it's not just about the nicotine. It's about what the vaping is doing for you, or in your daughter's case, what she thinks it's doing for her. As they talked, Michael found himself drawing on experiences he hadn't even realized he'd processed. He explained how teenage vaping often connected to social pressure and identity formation, just as his own vaping had been tied to stress management and professional identity. The key is understanding the why, Michael explained, sketching a simple diagram on his notepad. Once you know what role vaping plays in someone's life, you can start building alternatives. That evening, thinking about his conversation with Tom, Michael called Dr. Roberts to discuss the possibility of starting a support group at the community center. The construction industry taught me that every successful project needs scaffolding, he told her. Maybe we could be that for others. The doctor's enthusiasm surprised him. That's actually perfect timing, she said. I've had several patients asking about vaping cessation support, but there's nothing specific to vaping in the area. Would you consider leading a group? The suggestion initially terrified him. Standing in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, Michael felt the familiar flutter of self-doubt. But then he heard Jake's voice from the living room, talking with friends over his gaming headset, confidently explaining a complex strategy. When had his son become so self-assured? I'll do it, Michael heard himself say. The first support group meeting was scheduled for the following week. Michael spent hours preparing, reviewing his journals, organizing his thoughts about what had worked and what hadn't. But nothing could have prepared him for the actual experience. 8 people showed up that first night, sitting in a nervous circle in the community center's meeting room. As Michael shared his story, he watched their expressions shift from skepticism to recognition. When he described the morning cravings, the social pressure, the way vaping had become intertwined with every aspect of his life, heads nodded in understanding. One participant, a woman about his age named Rachel, spoke about her struggles as a single mother trying to quit. I feel like I'm failing my kids, she admitted, but I can't seem to stop. Michael recognized his own past struggles in her words. You're not failing, he told her. You're here, aren't you? That's not failure. That's taking the first step toward change. As he shared his strategies, the importance of understanding triggers, the value of replacement activities, the need for support systems, Michael found himself gaining new insights into his own journey. Teaching others helped him articulate concepts he'd only intuitively understood before. The group decided to meet weekly, and each session brought new revelations. Michael learned that while everyone's story was unique, certain patterns were universal. The way vaping became a crutch for emotional regulation, the fear of facing life without it, the struggle to redefine oneself. These themes emerged repeatedly. One evening, after a particularly powerful session where a young man had shared his breakthrough moment, Jake asked to attend the next meeting. I want to understand better, he explained. Plus, some kids at school are starting to vape. Maybe I could help them. Michael felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. It might be intense, he warned. People share pretty personal stuff. I can handle it, Dad. You taught me that, remember? The next meeting, with Jake quietly observing from the corner, took on new meaning. Michael found himself choosing his words more carefully, aware that his son was watching not just him, but the whole process of adults struggling with and overcoming addiction. During a break, Rachel approached them. Your dad's helping a lot of people, she told Jake. My kids noticed the change in me too, just like you did with him. Later that night, Michael added a new section to his journal titled Lessons from Teaching Others. He wrote about how helping people through their first week brought him back to his own early struggles, but with new perspective. How explaining the process to others strengthened his own resolve. How each person's success felt, in some small way, like a validation of his own journey. The warehouse project was nearing completion now, and Michael often used it as a metaphor in group sessions. Recovery is like this building, he would say. First, you need a strong foundation, understanding your triggers and patterns. Then you build new structures, habits, and coping mechanisms. Finally, you work on the finishing touches, the new identity you're creating for yourself. 6 months into his own journey, Michael received another email from Tom. His daughter had agreed to attend the next support group meeting. She says if you could do it, maybe she can too, Tom wrote. Preparing for that session, Michael realized how much his life had changed. He was no longer just avoiding vaping. He was actively building something new, something that reached beyond his own recovery to touch others' lives. That night's meeting was different. With a teenager present, the dynamic shifted. The adults shared their stories with new vulnerability, aware that their experiences might help prevent another young person from starting down the same path. Tom's daughter listened quietly, but Michael noticed her wiping away tears during one particularly honest share. After the meeting, she approached him. "How did you deal with feeling different?" she asked. "When your friends were all vaping and you weren't?" Michael thought carefully before answering. "I realized that feeling different wasn't a weakness," he said. "It was a sign that I was growing into someone stronger than I used to be." Driving home with Jake, Michael reflected on how teaching others had become an unexpected source of strength in his own recovery. Each person's struggle and triumph reinforced his commitment to his new life. Each shared story added another layer of understanding to his own journey. "You know what I learned tonight, Dad?" Jake said suddenly. "It's not just about stopping something bad. It's about becoming something better." Michael smiled, hearing his own journey echoed in his son's words. "That's exactly right, buddy. That's exactly right." In his journal that night, Michael wrote, "Sometimes the best way to stay strong is to help others find their strength. In teaching, we learn. In giving support, we find support." The journey isn't just about quitting anymore. It's about creating ripples of change that extend far beyond ourselves. The next morning, preparing for another day at the construction site, Michael felt a deep sense of purpose. He was building more than just a warehouse, more than just a vape-free life. He was building hope, one story, one meeting, one person at a time. Chapter 7. Building a Legacy Beyond Personal Victory. 1 year. Michael sat at his desk in the completed warehouse project, now transformed into a modern office space, and opened his journal to the first entry he'd made that night when he decided to quit vaping. The desperate scribbles of a man searching for a way out seemed to belong to a different person entirely. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a design feature he'd fought for during the renovation. Natural light changes everything, he'd insisted to the project team. Now, sitting in that same light, he realized how symbolic that decision had been. His journey out of addiction had been exactly that, a gradual movement from darkness into light. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. 6 months vape-free today. Couldn't have done it without your help. My kids say thank you. Attached was a photo of her family at a beach, all smiles and clear skies. Michael smiled, remembering her first support group meeting, how lost she had seemed. Now she was helping lead the sessions herself. The support group had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. What started as 8 nervous people in a community center had evolved into a network of over 50 regular members, with new faces appearing each week. They'd even started a separate teen group, co-led by Jake and Tom's daughter Sarah, focusing on prevention and peer support. "Dad." Jake's voice came from the doorway. At 16 now, he'd grown taller, more confident. "Can we talk about something?" Michael gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting how their roles had shifted over the past year. These conversations had evolved from father teaching son to something more like equals sharing wisdom. "My friend Chris started vaping," Jake said. "He's asking for help stopping, but he's embarrassed about coming to the group. I thought maybe you could tell me what to say to him." Michael leaned back, thinking carefully. "What do you think he needs to hear?" Jake's response surprised him. "I think he needs to know it's not just about stopping something. It's about starting something better. That's what you always say, right?" Michael nodded, proud of how deeply his son had internalized these lessons. "Tell me more about what you mean by that." As Jake explained his thoughts about helping his friend, Michael reflected on how his quit journey had rippled out to affect so many others. His son had developed a maturity and empathy that amazed him. The support group members had formed lasting friendships, supporting each other through not just addiction, but life's various challenges. Even at work, things had changed. The warehouse project had been completed ahead of schedule, partly because of his improved focus and decision-making. Several contractors had commented on the transformation they'd witnessed in his management style. More patient, more present, more effective. You know, Michael said to Jake, when I first quit vaping, I thought success meant just not vaping anymore. But that was just the beginning. Jake nodded. It's like that building project. You didn't just fix what was broken. You made something new, something better. Later that afternoon, Michael visited Dr. Roberts for their monthly check-in, which had evolved from addiction support to discussions about community health and prevention. They'd been working on a proposal to implement a vaping prevention program in local schools, using peer mentors trained by their teen support group. I never expected to be here, Michael admitted. When I first walked into your office, I just wanted to stop feeling like a slave to nicotine. Now we're talking about changing entire communities. Dr. Roberts smiled. That's often how real change works. It starts with one person making a choice, then ripples outward in ways we can't predict. That evening, Michael attended a special support group session, a celebration of collective milestones. As he listened to others share their stories, he heard his own journey echoed in their words. The initial struggles, the moments of doubt, the gradual discovery of strength they didn't know they possessed. A new member, barely a week into his quit attempt, asked Michael, "Does it ever get completely easy? Do the cravings ever totally go away?" Michael thought carefully before responding. "It's not about it getting easy," he said. "It's about getting stronger. The cravings might visit occasionally, like old memories, but they don't control you anymore. You build a life so full of meaningful things that there's no room for vaping." After the meeting, walking to his car under a star-filled sky, Michael remembered something Jake had said months ago. "You're not just teaching people how to quit vaping, Dad. You're teaching them how to change their lives." At home, Michael opened his journal one last time that day. The pages were filled with a year's worth of struggles, victories, insights, and growth. But more than that, they told the story of transformation. Not just his own, but the transformations he'd witnessed in others. He wrote, "1 year ago, I thought this journey was about ending something. I was wrong. It was about beginning something. Every day without vaping became a day with something else. More presence with Jake, better leadership at work, deeper connections with others. Success isn't measured in days without vaping. It's measured in moments of genuine living, in lives touched, in hope shared. The cravings taught me patience. The struggles taught me empathy. The victories taught me humility." To anyone reading this who's just starting their journey, know that you're not just fighting an addiction. You're building a legacy. Every day you choose not to vape is a day you choose to be fully present in your life. Every craving you overcome makes you stronger. Every moment of doubt you push through creates wisdom you can share with others. The warehouse project is complete now, but the real construction continues in the lives we touch, the examples we set, the hope we share. That's the true measure of success. Not just ending an addiction, but building something beautiful in its place. Michael closed his journal and looked out his window at the night sky. Somewhere out there, Rachel was celebrating with her family. Jake was probably texting encouragement to his friend Chris. Tom's daughter Sarah was perhaps planning the next teen support meeting. Dozens of others were finding their way, one day at a time, toward lives free from addiction. He thought about all the construction projects he'd managed over the years, but none compared to this. The building of hope, the architecture of change, the legacy of transformation that would continue long after his own journey had become just a story to share. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help others, new chances to strengthen the foundation he'd built. But tonight, in the quiet of his study, Michael felt a deep sense of peace. He had not just quit vaping. He had built something far more valuable, a blueprint for change that others could follow, a legacy of hope that would continue to grow. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now he knew, with unshakable certainty, that every step forward was a step towards something better, not just for himself, but for everyone his story would touch. And that he realized was the greatest victory of all. Epilogue, your journey begins. 5 years have passed since Michael first put down his vape pen and picked up his journal that fateful night. The community center, where it all began, now hosts multiple support groups across the city. The teen prevention program he helped start with Jake has become a model for schools nationwide. But perhaps the most meaningful change isn't in the programs or the numbers. It's in the countless individual stories of transformation. On a warm spring evening, Michael stands at the podium in a packed auditorium at the local high school. Parents, teachers, and students have gathered for a special presentation on vaping prevention and recovery. As he looks out at the sea of faces, he sees his own story reflected in their eyes. The struggle, the hope, the possibility of change. When I started my journey to quit vaping, he begins, I thought I was just trying to break an addiction. I had no idea I was actually starting a new chapter in my life. None of us do when we first make that decision to change. He pauses, letting his gaze sweep across the room. Jake sits in the front row, now a college student studying psychology, inspired by the transformations he witnessed in the support groups. Next to him is Sarah, Tom's daughter, who turned her own struggle with vaping into a passion for helping other teens. Rachel is there too, 3 years vape-free, with her children beaming proudly beside her. The truth about quitting vaping, or any addiction, is that it's not just about what you're giving up. It's about what you're choosing instead. Every time you resist a craving, you're not just saying no to nicotine. You're saying yes to being present in your life. You're saying yes to being the person you want to become. Michael shares the core lessons he's learned, not just from his own journey, but from witnessing hundreds of others walk the same path. First, that change becomes possible when we approach it with understanding rather than judgment. The critical thinking tools that helped him break free from addiction work because they replace shame with insight, fear with knowledge. Second, that true transformation happens in community. None of us can do it alone, nor should we have to. Every person who breaks free from addiction becomes a beacon of hope for others still struggling. Third, that the journey never really ends, it just evolves. What begins as a battle against addiction becomes a journey of personal growth, then a mission to help others, and finally a way of living that enriches not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us. To those of you here tonight who are struggling with vaping, he continues, I want you to know something important. Your struggle is not a sign of weakness. It's an opportunity for strength. The very fact that you're here, listening, considering change, that's already a victory. He holds up his old journal, its pages worn and dog-eared. This journal started as a way to track my cravings. It became a record of transformation. Each of you has your own story waiting to be written, your own transformation waiting to begin. After the presentation, a young teenager approaches Michael, twisting the strings of his hoodie nervously. Do you ever miss it? He asks. Vaping, Michael considers the question carefully. I miss who I thought I was when I vaped, someone who had it all under control, who could handle stress, who fit in. But then I found out who I really am without it, and that person is so much stronger, so much more real. That's what I want for you. Not just freedom from vaping, but the chance to discover who you really are. As the auditorium empties, Michael stays behind, watching families and friends cluster in small groups, sharing their own stories, making connections, beginning their own journeys. Jake joins him on the stage. Pretty different from where we started, huh, Dad? Michael smiles, remembering those early morning walks when Jake was still in high school, when every step was a battle against cravings. Different in all the best ways. And that's really what this book has been about, not just how to stop vaping, but how to use that challenge as a catalyst for profound personal change. Every person who reads these pages will face their own unique journey, their own struggles and victories, their own moments of doubt and breakthrough. But the fundamental truth remains. Change is possible. Not just the surface change of breaking an addiction, but the deep, lasting change that transforms us into stronger, more authentic versions of ourselves. As you close this book and begin your own journey, remember that you're not just trying to quit vaping. You're starting a new chapter in your life story. Every craving you face is an opportunity to choose who you want to be. Every challenge is a chance to discover your own strength. The path ahead may not be easy, but it will be worth it. And somewhere out there, someone like Michael, like Jake, like Rachel or Sarah, is ready to help light the way. All you have to do is take the first step. Your journey begins now.